David Haynes. Dave is the editorial page editor of the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and we're glad to have Dave with us today. First, let me thank Professor Chetty for his very thought-provoking remarks. And I have so many questions, but let me begin with one that plays off your final comments. You're talking about education and what we can do with education and how that can be, in some respects, a game changer. Is it because, Professor, that it has the single greatest impact, or is it because a couple of the other factors we looked at, segregation, whether we have two-parent families, that those are awfully difficult to do with policy? Is that what's happening here?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. And I think it's absolutely the second. I think education is very important, as I illustrated with the numbers on the impacts, but it's possible that segregation is actually even more important. I don't have data to measure that I showed you on the impacts of segregation. So first of all, from an empirical point of view, it's difficult. We're actually trying, this is one of the projects we're engaged in, trying to figure out how to identify the impacts of segregation on kids. But even if we were able to do that, and you know that this is mayor, it's very difficult to figure out how to implement policies that change where people live and that create more mixed income neighborhoods. You can try to legislate that, but the fact is people choose where to live. And if they decide, higher income people decide that my kids are going to do better in certain schools, you can't forcibly create mixed income neighborhoods. So I actually think it's possible that the way you might have an impact on segregation is through schools. If you improve schools in certain areas, that's going to attract people to move back to the center of the city and possibly create more mixed income areas.
On the school issue, to what extent is early childhood education a factor, and how much of a factor do you think it is?
I think early childhood education is very important. Interventions in kindergarten or even before have long-lasting effects. But, and this is contrary to what I think you hear in the popular media, it's not just early childhood education that's important. A lot of that evidence I was showing you comes from improvements in teacher quality in 3rd grade, 5th grade, 8th grade, and we basically find flat effects all the way through from K through 8. A better teacher helps you in kindergarten, a better teacher helps you in 4th grade, a better teacher helps you in 8th grade. And a better teacher probably helps you in high school. That's not in our data, but as far as we can tell, better education helps all the way through. That's very important because this push towards early childhood education, while I think it's valuable, sometimes creates the impression that, oh, if we hadn't helped you out by the time you're age 7, we've missed the boat and we kind of have to give up. And that's, I think, totally incorrect.
I was going to ask you about these surprises in here that you touched on, because I think it is counterintuitive to some people when they look at a Charlotte or a Raleigh and they see these economic hubs of the South. Is it possible that things have changed since these kids were born in 1980 or something like that? I mean, these kids are now 30 years old. Is it possible that those cities have changed? Is it possible that Milwaukee has changed from the numbers we saw there?
So it's certainly possible that things are changing over time. In fact, the hope is that things will change over time in some of these cities that don't have high levels of upward mobility. What I can say is this. Within the period we're able to study, so let's say we look at kids' college attendance chances, right? We can do that even for kids who were born in 1993, because they're going to be in college by today, right? And we find basically the same disparities in college attendance for kids who grew up were born in 1993 as the kids who were born in 1980. So it doesn't look like a great deal has changed. Now, certainly, we haven't investigated in detail. Some places may have improved slightly. But it's still true that in Atlanta, for kids born in 1993, if they're from a low-income family, they still have a pretty low chance of going to college. Now, you might say, what about kids who were born in 2000 or 2005? Well, obviously, I don't know what their earnings are going to be if they're 5 years old today, so it's possible that it'll change going forward.
A question on the dosage factor that you talked about. And you said that if the child moves to an upwardly mobile community later in life, the chances that he or she would end up doing better decrease. What about a student, I don't know if you've studied this or not, but what about a student who graduates and then moves to a community that is more upwardly mobile?
That's a great question. I actually don't know, I mean, to be honest, I don't know the answer to that question. And it's because of a statistical problem more than anything else. So we're able to identify, we think quite convincingly, the effects of moving to a better area if the kid moves along with the parents. And in particular, we're able to compare the outcomes of siblings. So suppose you and I are brothers and you're 4 years older than me, and we move to Salt Lake City at a certain point, then I'm going to be exposed to Salt Lake City for 4 additional years relative to you, right? And we can see that my outcomes are proportionately better than yours based on the relative amount of time we've spent in the better area. It's very hard to implement kind of an experiment like that when kids have graduated and are choosing on their own where to move, right? So for instance, you might find that kids who move to Manhattan do really well. That's not necessarily because Manhattan is making them do really well. It's because they did really well growing up in Iowa that they got a job in Manhattan that's helping them succeed, right? So it's tricky to piece that out.
I wondered about that, and the brain drain issue that we talked about in Wisconsin as well.
Yeah, and I think brain drain issue is a serious concern. A lot of rural Wisconsin producing great outcomes. What's happening there? 70% of those successful kids, they are not living in Wisconsin when we measure their earnings. They're living in Chicago, they're living in New York, they're living in San Francisco. So that's something I didn't emphasize, but we define areas based on where kids grow up, but then we track you no matter where you live in the U.S. And lots of the most successful kids, especially from rural areas, are living in a totally different place when we're seeing them in 30.
I think you went into this with the idea that you're going to look at tax expenditures. Do taxes have any impact on the numbers we've seen there?
Yes, so, and that's why I mentioned tax credits at the end. Taxes are potentially important, I think, especially insofar as they fund schools. And so we do find a significant correlation with local property tax rates. Places with higher property tax rates, which typically have better funded schools, tend to have better outcomes. But we see stronger correlations with many of the other factors, like direct measures of school quality, segregation, and so forth. So I think tax credits can potentially be a useful tool. But as I was saying, I think the solution here is not just to say we need to spend more money on our schools, it's that we need to spend more money effectively on our schools, focusing on certain aspects that really matter.
What about other kinds of social spending? Did you measure the impact of other kinds of spending on social issues?
Yeah, so one of the things we looked at, for example, is the size of local earned income tax credits that give low-income families additional assistance. Again, we didn't find nearly as large an impact as we do with some of these other factors. So simply giving families more money, that's actually what you might have thought at first glance might matter, right? We're seeing these really big differences in outcomes between low-income families and high-income families. What if we just try to close that gap in incomes by giving low-income families additional tax credits and pulling up their resources? That doesn't have as large an effect, I think, as some of these other factors.
Were you surprised by the variation around the country? I know I was when I saw it, and particularly, as you pointed out early on, that areas that economically seem to be doing well don't necessarily have high upward mobility.
We were certainly very surprised, right? So we went into the project asking, is America the land of opportunity? Which is a question many people have. It's not, is California the land of opportunity, or is Wisconsin the land of opportunity? But it turns out that that's very much the question it seems like you should be asking. And what struck me is not merely that there are large regional differences, but there are very large differences within places that are a couple of hours of driving distance of each other. And moreover, as you pointed out, there's actually no correlation between average incomes in an area and levels of upward mobility. So that's why places like Raleigh and Charlotte and Atlanta, which we typically think of as booming cities, do not seem to be, systematically better in this upward mobility measure. The way to think about it is Atlanta is producing a lot of good jobs and has a vibrant economy, but kids who grow up in Atlanta, unfortunately, when they're from disadvantaged families, are not doing so well.
This is something I don't think you looked at, but I'm wondering about it. Immigration. Does immigration, the passion, the energy of new residents in this country, does it fuel some some of these cities? Does it contribute to better conditions, better opportunities for children as they grow up?
Yeah, it's a great question. We did look at immigration. So there are two things there. First, I think immigrants themselves tend to have high rates of upward mobility. That's perhaps not that surprising because they're very motivated to come to this country, and a lot of them are specifically looking to give their kids better opportunities and so on. But the fraction of immigrants in an area does not our hypothesis was very much aligned with yours, but in the end, the fraction of immigrants in an area is not that highly correlated with rates of upward mobility. How can you see that? Take North Dakota, take Iowa. These are some of the places with the highest levels of upward mobility. They don't have very high immigrant shares. On the other hand, take San Jose or take the southern part of California, very high immigrant shares, and they do have high levels of upward mobility, so it doesn't seem to correlate systematically.
Well, another famous economist, Paul Krugman, in a column reacting to your study, essentially said that sprawl has killed racial algebra. And he's citing Atlanta, where there isn't good public transit, and people tend to be segregated in pockets by income. So it's hard to get to where the jobs are.